Today we're starting on Immanuel Kant, who was arguably the greatest philosopher who ever lived. And the work that we're going to be reading and talking about, his critique of pure reason, is arguably the greatest work of philosophy that's ever written. Kant's dates are from 1724 to 1804. He lived almost all of his life in Königsberg in East Prussia, which is now part of the Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania. At that time, it was part of Germany or Prussia. He went to the University of Königsberg, got his degree there, and eventually became a professor of logic and metaphysics. During his early career, he did as much work in mathematics and physics as he did in philosophy. Even were he not famous as a philosopher, he would have been famous in the history of astronomy, since he formulated many theories about the nature of the solar system that were the first of his kind, in particular the theory that the moon originated from the Earth. He was so regular and uniform in his habits that the residents of Königsberg would set their watch by his walks. And he would take the same route through Königsberg across the many bridges. In fact, there's still a mathematical problem about how to walk around Königsberg and cross the many bridges that Kant's route took him on. His three great works were the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, which is on morality, and then the Critique of Judgment, which is on aesthetics, or on the nature of beauty. Later in his life, he published a work called Perpetual Peace, which was the forerunner of the Enlightenment call for a world government and for a structure of political systems that would allow for peace according to Enlightenment principles. He was one of the major figures of the Enlightenment. We consider him to be the last modern philosopher and the first postmodern philosopher. Just as Hume and Berkeley published sort of popular abstracts of their great works, so Kant produced more condensed and simplified versions of his great works. So for the Critique of Pure Reason, he published a work called the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Prolegomena is just a word that means prologue or preparatory material. And it has more or less the same subject as the Critique of Pure Reason that we'll talk about. Many of you will read in your ethics classes selections from the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, sometimes just called by its German name, the Grundlegung. And it was the theory of morality that is studied in all ethics classes about the categorical imperative, which is extract from the Critique of Practical Reason. Kant didn't publish a shorter version of the Critique of Judgment, which dealt with issues of beauty in nature and beauty in art. So one of the things that makes Kant great, but also makes him in some ways have the reputation of being difficult to read and understand, is Kant's very careful and meticulous use of technical terminology or jargon, philosophical jargon, creating and making up words and using words in very specific and technical ways, and what's called his architectonic. Architectonic is just a word to describe the architecture, the systematic structure of a person's thought. And we'll be talking about the systematic structure both of Kant's work as a whole and of the Critique of Pure Reason. But you can click on the link that's associated with this page and is at the top under the heading to get this document, which is a glossary of Kantian terms. And you'll be much more successful in understanding Kant if you if you get clear about the meanings of these basic terms. We'll talk about a number of them today, including analytic and synthetic, a posteriori and a priori, and the basic faculties of imagination, judgment, reason, and understanding. But it'll be useful to you to be able to understand these specific meanings. They would be worth committing to memory if you were up to the task of studying them and making sure you're clear about them. Let's talk a little bit about the architectonic structure of Kant's philosophy. We'll get into all of the details of this now. But Kant thought that there were at least 4 different basic cognitive faculties. We'll see that another is often added as judgment. But the 4 basic ones that will be talked about in the Critique of Pure Reason are sensibility, which is where we interact with the external world and get inputs or intuitions, which is what Kant called the inputs that we get through our senses. There's imagination, which actually performs the act of creating images. Imagination is the faculty of producing images. There's the understanding, which we might normally call reason. Kant is going to restrict the use of reason as a technical term to something else. So the Verstand, or understanding for Kant, is the faculty of concepts that allows us to think and allows us to understand and organize our experience. And then there's reason, which is the faculty, the self-reflective faculty that attempts to give rise to metaphysics and attempts to go beyond experience. One of the terms that it's important to sort of understand right off the bat is the term transcendental. We'll see it again and again in Kant's philosophy. It has 2 different meanings. It can mean either beyond possible experience, which is what it means here in the sense of transcendental ideas. We often talk about transcendental objects as those that are supernatural or exist outside of possible experience. Remember, we've been using the word transcendent in this class as synonymous with outside of space and time in another world. But Kant also used the word transcendental in another sense that's more or less unique to him, which became very important in the history of philosophy. And that sense is pertaining to the necessary requirements for any bit of knowledge or field. So transcendental means pertaining to the necessary requirements for a bit of knowledge or for an object. And we'll see that Kant's method is going to be transcendental in that he's going to be looking at facts and knowledge that we have and asking about the necessary requirements that we can infer about them to figure out the underlying structures that produce the types of abilities that our mind has. We're going to see that the Critique of Pure Reason will be sort of organized around these 4 different faculties, as we'll see. And Kant's 3 great works, the 3 great critiques, the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment, involve the architectonic structure that arises from these faculties. The Critique of Pure Reason will deal with the understanding and the limits of our faculty of cognition as it applies to nature. The faculty of desire, or reason, will give rise to morality. It guides our freedom. The power of judgment, the ability to apply our concepts to particular cases, will give rise to feelings of pleasure and displeasure that allow us to enjoy art and give us evidence of purposiveness in nature. So the three critiques sort of follow along this architectonic. And we'll see that not only is the critique of pure reason meticulously planned according to these structures, but all three critiques, his entire body of work, was meticulously planned out according to this categorization of the different faculties of human beings. That's something that makes Kant a great philosopher, is the meticulous way in which he organized his inquiry into the different features of the human mind. So let's look at the architectonic of the Critique of Pure Reason. The Critique of Pure Reason was actually published in two different editions, the first edition in 1781 and the second edition in 1787. The first edition was thought to be translated by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and was deeply influential to the Romantic tradition of literature through his early translation. But the two different editions are so important and contain such independently useful material that whereas usually a second edition would supersede the first, in all English translations, including the one we're using by Norman Kemp Smith, the two different translations, or the two different editions rather, are published side by side, or published along with each other. In some cases, the two editions are identical, in which case they'll have the same page numbers. The first edition is usually marked with A page numbers, or A numbers. The second edition is marked with numbers that correspond to B, or the second edition. So there'll be lots of passages in our work where they have the same A and B numbers. But there'll be some works that we'll read that only appeared in the A edition. We're going to read the A version of the transcendental deduction of the categories. And we'll also read the separate and different version of the transcendental deduction in the B, or the second edition of the critique. So that's what those A and B numbers mean in the margins of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. A is first edition, B is second edition. What we're looking at here is the table of contents of the second edition. And you can see that the Critique of Pure Reason is broken up into two different sections, a transcendental doctrine of elements and a transcendental doctrine of method. The most important part is that all that we're going to be reading is selections from the transcendental doctrine of elements. Again, you have to sort of know the meanings of the terms in order to sort of decipher this architectonic. Transcendental, remember, means pertaining to the necessary condition. So this is part one that we're going to talk about, are the necessary conditions of the elements of understanding, the elements of our cognitive capacities. The transcendental doctrine of method will deal with how we can proceed in our thinking about metaphysics or pure reason once we've gotten clear about the ground, the transcendental requirements of our cognitive faculties and their limitations. It's called the Critique of Pure Reason because it wants to inquire into how our cognitive faculties work and also how they have limits beyond which we can't go. Remember the popular version, this was called a prologue or prolegomena to any future metaphysics. So this first part is the limits on pure thought or metaphysical thought, and the second part is then knowing those limits, how would we proceed? Again, we're going to be concentrating only on this first part. And the two parts that we're going to look at correspond to the two first faculties There is the sensibility, which is the senses and how we get input from the external world through our senses. And then there's the understanding, which has concepts that allow us to understand it and organize it. The term used for the senses is the term aesthetics. Nowadays, we use the word aesthetic to refer to beauty. I teach a course in aesthetics on the nature of beauty. But the more original meaning of the term aesthetics was from the Greek term aesthesis, which just meant sense experience. So aesthetic here just means sense experience. The transcendental aesthetic are going to be the necessary requirements, the requirements of sense experience. And we're going to see that space and time are the two necessary requirements, or transcendental conditions is the phrase that Kant would use, of sense experience. And then there's going to be transcendental logic. Logic is the faculty of concepts and of the understanding. So that's going to be the necessary requirements, or the conditions, or the foundations of conceptual thought. And they're going to be involved with the way in which science works. There'll be a transcendental analytic, which will analyze out the necessary conditions of conceptual thought that give rise to science. We'll see that this deals with what he calls the categories, which are a type of concept. The transcendental dialectic deals with the contradictions. You may remember dialectic had to do with thesis and antithesis and then synthesis. The transcendental dialectic shows what happens when you attempt to go beyond the bounds of science and go beyond the bounds of our experience in applying concepts and the contradictions that it lands you into. So that's the plan of the section of the Critique of Pure Reason that we're going to talk about. The basic idea is, again, looking at the foundations and limits of our cognitive faculties. There's the foundations and limits of our senses, and those foundations end up to be space and time. There's the foundations and limits of our thought, which is transcendental logic. The transcendental analytic will be the foundations of our thought, the necessary requirements of conceptual thought and science. And the transcendental dialectic will show the problems you run into when you go beyond the limits that the Critique of Pure Reason establishes. So Kant's great idea that he introduces in the B version of the preface, which is the version that we're reading, the version from the second edition, he calls the Copernican revolution in philosophy. You may remember that the Copernican revolution in Copernicus, remember Copernicus was the 16th century astronomer who was the first modern person to suggest that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, but that the sun was. And he uses Copernicus's revolution as a metaphor for his great idea, which is going to end modern philosophy and begin postmodern philosophy. But it's important to see exactly what he was referring to in Copernicus, because we're often misled, because the popular way of understanding Copernicus' significance is to say that he made us less important. He took us out of the center of the universe and instead made us an insignificant planet around a sun in a much bigger universe. But that's not at all what Kant has in mind when he calls this the Copernican revolution. Just as we pointed out when we talked about the scientific revolution, Copernicus was interested in the motion of the sun across the sky and interested in telling whether that motion came from the outside, whether what we were actually seeing was the motion of the sun, or whether it was coming from something that was relative to us, whether what we were seeing was really our own motion as the sun moved across the sky. And again, Copernicus's insight was to see that what we were seeing moving was not the real motion of the sun coming from the outside, but was our motion as we were on the Earth revolving on its axis. So Kant's Copernican revolution is going to be a similar shift in the way in which we see that representational model of knowledge. Remember, the modern view that arose from the scientific revolution and began with Descartes was that mind's eye model that said we don't perceive external objects directly, we perceive only the contents of our own mind. And then the question was, how can we determine when the images in our mind are really equal to or really correspond to the external objects outside of us? There were all ways of trying to figure out how we can make sure that our mental images and representations were coming from the outside. For Descartes and the rationalists, they solved that problem by thinking that we had innate ideas built into our mind, or a light of nature, a true idea detector that would tell us when our ideas were true and when they corresponded to things outside of us. And for the empiricists, they would trace out the pattern or the process by which our impressions arose in our mind and formed ideas, and how external objects moved into our mind and created our ideas and our thought. But both of them were trying to figure out how we can be sure that external objects really did determine our ideas, and that therefore our ideas were equal to or true of or corresponded to those external things. And the sad end of that story, which supposedly woke Kant from his dogmatic slumber, was Hume's final conclusion that we don't really know that the ideas we have correspond to anything external. There's no basis apart from custom and habit for knowing that our ideas are true of the world, or that the expectations that we make on the basis of causality are really based upon external objects. So Kant's Copernican revolution is going to say that it actually works the other way, that the world that we experience is one that's constructed by us according to our cognitive faculties, and that the only way we can be certain of anything about what's going on in the world is by finding in that world things that our own mind has put into it. So Kant is going to claim that it's our mind that imposes structure on reality, and that what we call objectivity isn't coming from the outside. The reason why we all see the same world and identify the same objects is not going to be because of the similarity of the external reality outside of us. It's going to be because we're all using the same shared or intersubjective structuring activities that we impose upon experience. So Kant's Copernican revolution is to shift the way in which we understand our relationship to our reality. In the modern view, external objects determine the mind. On the postmodern view, it's our cognitive faculties that help construct our experience of the world. So he said with respect to Copernicus that he failed trying to explain the movement of heavenly bodies on the supposition they all revolved around the spectator. Instead, he made the spectator revolve and saw that the motion was due to us and not to the motion of the sun. And that led him to the conclusion he thinks that Galileo came upon as well, that reason has insight only into that which it produces after a plan of its own. He uses a famous metaphor from Bacon that he uses as the motto of the Critique of Pure Reason, that will hold nature down and force her to answer our questions, and that it's not nature that's determining the answers to our questions, but it's only the activity of our mind that place those answers into the natural world, and it's reason's own determining that is able to answer the questions that we pose to nature. So whereas in the modern period, objectivity came from the outside, the Kant's Copernican revolution is to say that we're active in experience, and that what we call objectivity is really just shared structures. These are the things that he's going to call transcendental structures. And those are intersubjective structuring activities that we impose upon experience from the inside. We'll see what that means, but for now it's enough to understand that Kant's main idea is that our mind is active in experience, and that the structure of our experience comes from the inside, from our structuring activity, and not from external objects, not from the influence on the outside. And we'll see that just as he thought that Copernicus failed because he tried and tried and tried to figure out how motions of the planets outside of us could be making these motions in the sky, but only succeeded when he saw that it was really our motion. So Kant thinks that modern philosophy showed the same thing, that in the attempt to show how external facts can get into us, modern philosophy, culminating in Hume, shows that it's impossible. And Kant instead is going to change the question, change the way of seeing the problem in order to solve it. If we tried to figure out how external objects could get into us, we would always fail. The only way in which there can be scientific truths about external reality is if we ourselves, through the cognitive activity of our mind, impose those structures on our experience. That's what a transcendental condition is, as we'll see. So, in the introduction, Kant starts to explain what the critique of pure reason is, and introduces how his solution is going to work. And he does this by introducing a pair, two different pairs of terms that we've encountered already in David Hume. The first pair is a priori and a posteriori. A priori means, remember, known prior to or independent of experience. For Kant, he uses the word pure as a synonym for a priori. Pure means not having any experience mixed in with it. So the critique of pure reason is really a critique of a priori reason. Metaphysics is sometimes thought of as knowledge that goes beyond experience, knowledge that doesn't come from facts like science does. So a critique of pure reason is a critique of a certain type of metaphysics, a certain type of knowledge that doesn't come from experience, which was what the whole debate between the rationalists and empiricists was about. The rationalists saying we did have that type of knowledge, the empiricists saying we don't, that all knowledge is limited to our senses. So a priori and a posteriori, posterior to the senses, should be familiar to us. A posteriori knowledge, our knowledge of matters of fact, you would say, things that we know from experience, that we couldn't know unless we actually saw them. How many fingers do I have up? Since you can't see them, you have no way of knowing that a priori before you look. If I show you, then you might know that I had 3 fingers up. A priori means known before experience. It would have to be a fact that you could know before you looked, purely, independently of any experience. Hume sometimes used the second distinction. He called them matters of fact and relations of ideas. Although he didn't distinguish between these two different pairs, a priori, a posteriori, and analytic and synthetic, in the rigorous way that Kant did. Analytic statements are statements that work by analysis of the subject. In an analytic statement, the predicate is already contained in the subject. If I say a triangle has 3 sides, the idea of having 3 sides, the predicate, is already contained in the idea of triangle. I've done nothing more but sort of spell out explicitly or analyze, cut into pieces and make clear the meaning that was already contained in the subject, triangle. If I say all bachelors are unmarried men, that means that bachelor just means to be an unmarried man. So I haven't given you any new information. Sometimes those are called tautologies or empty truths. They're true merely in virtue of meaning, true merely in virtue of the law of non-contradiction, as Hume had said. Synthetic statements are ones where the predicate really adds something to the subject. They actually say something about the world. So saying that I have 3 fingers up, or that Rome is a city in Italy, those are statements that add to the subject and therefore say something about the world. So if we look at the different possible combinations of those, that'll help clarify what Kant thinks is the subject matter of metaphysics and the critique of pure reason, the critique of a priori reason or metaphysics. So analytic a priori would be known before experience and true in virtue of meaning. There are lots of analytic a priori statements that just spell out the meaning of things, like a triangle has 3 sides, or all bachelors are unmarried men. They're called tautologies, or sometimes empty truths, because they don't say anything about reality. They tell us about the meaning of terms. So there's no particular problem about analytic a priori terms. We don't think they tell us about the world. They're not metaphysics. They just spell out or elucidate the meanings of terms. Equally, there's no particular problem about this category, synthetic a posteriori facts. The cup is on the table. Chile is in the southern hemisphere. Those are facts that we only know through experience, and they're facts in which the predicate adds something to the subject. Those are all known through experience. There are no analytic a posteriori truths, because since it's analytic, since the subject contains the predicate, you don't need experience to get the predicate out of the subject. So this is an empty category. But the real question then is going to be, the critique of pure reason is about this 4th category. It's about the nature of synthetic a priori truths. Remember, a priori means before you experience it. Synthetic means really tells you something about the world. The predicate adds to the subject. So synthetic a priori truths are truths that tell you about the world, synthetic, before you look, a priori. And the critique of pure reason, spoiler alert, because this is the whole point of the entire book, is going to say that the synthetic a priori truths of science and mathematics are possible. There are scientific and mathematical truths that tell you about the world before you look. And they're only true because we ourselves impose those conditions or rules upon our experience. That's the Copernican revolution. And his critique of pure reason is going to be that metaphysics, synthetic a priori propositions that go beyond science and mathematics, are impossible. So in some sense, the whole critique of pure reason, which tries to answer the question, how are synthetic a priori propositions possible, is answered by this little box in our chart here. Science and mathematics are possible through transcendental conditions of experience, which we'll talk about, whereas metaphysics is impossible. So the whole question of the critique of pure reason is, how are synthetic a priori propositions possible? How could you possibly know about the world before you look? If I had a big room or a big building, and I asked you, who's in that building? What's the proportion of men to women in that building? You might think that it was impossible for you to know before you looked. In some sense, this was the problem of modern philosophy, right? You're trapped in this room with no doors and windows. You can't perceive the external world. All you can see are these images appearing in your little room in your mind. How can you know what's really out in the world? Kant says you can't know what's out in the world without looking, unless there were some type of transcendental condition. So how can I know what the proportion of males and females in this building is without looking? That's the problem that the critique of pure reason takes up. How are synthetic a priori propositions about the world possible? And the answer is the Copernican revolution, that the mind is active in experience. It imposes transcendental conditions. By the word transcendental condition, remember transcendental means necessary condition. What we're talking about is a filter on possible experience. Let's then go back to our illustration of the building that we can't see into and how we could tell what the proportion of men and women are. If we knew, if we watched the door, if we knew it was empty and we watched the door very carefully and we put a bouncer in front of the door that would only let women in, imagine it's ladies' night or something. If there was a bouncer there that acted as a filter so that it only allowed women into the room, well, then we could know before we looked that everybody in the room was a woman. So that simple answer is Kant's Copernican revolution, that the only way we could have synthetic a priori propositions, the only way we could know about the world and know about our experience, what was going to be in our experience before we looked, is if we ourselves were imposing filters, conditions, or a bouncer on experience. So the rest of the book is going to be about the different types of transcendental conditions. So you might want to get used to understanding that word, transcendental conditions. It means the bouncer. It means a filter. That there are various different types of filters on our experience, and nothing that doesn't meet those filters or doesn't pass the bouncers can get into our experience. Therefore, we'll always know, even before we look, what's going to be in our experience. Just like we'll always know, as long as we know there's a bouncer there only letting women in, we already know before we look that the only things that are going to be inside of our room are going to be women. So we can sort of see, again, the whole outcome of the critique of pure reason that asks, how are synthetic a priori propositions possible? It's going to turn out that there will be a filter on sensibility. Remember, that was the transcendental aesthetic. There will be a filter on the understanding, which is concepts. And that will be, remember, called the transcendental logic. It's going to turn out that the critique of pure reason will show that metaphysics is impossible. That it's impossible to take the concepts of the understanding and apply them beyond all possible experience. So the critique of pure reason is going to explain how we can know mathematics as the bouncer on the senses, the filter on the senses, the transcendental condition on the senses, the transcendental aesthetic. How science is possible from the transcendental condition, the bouncer or the filter that our concepts provide on experience. That's called the transcendental logic. And we'll see, as we get into the details of it, that there will be a filter on space that will give rise to geometry, a filter on time that will give rise to arithmetic, and that there will be certain pure concepts or universal filters on our concepts that will give rise to science. So, strange as it may seem, Kant is going to think that reality outside of us doesn't contribute anything to our experience, that reality in itself is something we don't know anything about. It's like a great ball of dough or a great bowl of oatmeal with no structure and no reality to it whatsoever. It somehow passes its way into our experience, and our experience imposes a filter on it and breaks it up into discrete intuitions in sensibility. And then we'll see that the imagination will put that data together using the concepts that are provided by the understanding. In each of those activities, the filter of the sensibility and the concepts of the understanding will produce a bouncer, a filter, a transcendental condition, so that we'll already know ahead of time that everything we experience will be in accordance with the laws of mathematics and will be in accordance with the laws of science. But the application of that filter outside of experience, like if we ask, since there's a bouncer on experience, do we know what's going to be in the park down the street? Of course, we'd say no. The bouncer's not doing anything to the park down the street, so we have no way of knowing what exists outside of our little room that we're watching that has the filter. So in the same way, we can't apply the extension of concepts beyond all possible experience into metaphysics. And that will be the critique of pure or a priori reason.